I wasn't looking for a vanished empire, but then I found the maps. Cartographic collections from the early 19th century, tucked in university archives and private libraries, showed territorial boundaries that shouldn't exist. A massive expanse across Central Asia labeled with consistent nomenclature, administrative divisions, trade routes. And then, after 1816, nothing. The territory remains, but the labels change, the borders redraw, and the political entity vanishes as if it never existed. It began with a single discrepancy on a French military map from 1814. Certain cartographic works from the Napoleonic era depicting Central Asian territories show details that professional historians today struggle to explain. The French military map from 1814, produced for Napoleon's Eastern intelligence operations, displays what it labels as _0_, with the same cartographic specificity reserved for established European powers. Not vague territorial markings, not approximate boundaries, but detailed administrative divisions showing internal structure. Cities marked with population estimates. Trade routes drawn with precision, suggesting regular military knowledge. River systems labeled with navigational annotations. The map wasn't propaganda, it was operational intelligence, the kind military planners stake campaigns on. I started checking the provenance. The cartographer, Pierre Lapie, held official appointment as geographer to the French government. His maps of Europe are considered definitive for the period. No one questions his accuracy when depicting Prussia or the Austrian Empire. Yet this same cartographer, using the same methods, working from the same institutional standards, shows Tartaria as a functioning political entity occupying territory from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast. The eastern border aligns with Qing China. The southern extent reaches what we now call Afghanistan and northern India. The western boundary abuts Russian imperial possessions, and the northern reaches extend into Siberia, 7 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Australia. The detail is what matters. Cities like Tobolsk, Tomsk, and Astrakhan appear with notations indicating administrative centers, not frontier outposts, not trading posts, but seats of regional governance. The map shows road networks connecting these centers, the kind of infrastructure that requires sustained maintenance and centralized coordination. Fortification symbols mark defensive positions along borders. The cartographic language treats Tartaria exactly as it treats France, the Ottoman Empire, or any other recognized state. This wasn't speculative geography. Military cartographers don't waste resources mapping imaginary countries. The map sits in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Anyone can examine it. The archive catalog lists it without comment, just another Napoleonic-era military survey. But compare it to maps from the same collection, dated 1820, just 6 years later. The territory remains. The mountains, rivers, and cities all appear in the same locations. But Grande Tartarie has vanished. In its place, the 1820 maps show scattered labels: Russian possessions, Chinese territory, independent khanates. The unified political designation disappears completely. The question becomes unavoidable. If Tartaria was cartographic fiction, why did France's official military geographer map it with operational precision? And if it was reality, what happened between 1814 and 1820 to require its removal from French military intelligence? Let's examine what we're told about cartographic standards in the early 19th century. Mapmakers worked independently. National interests shaped territorial depictions, and political recognition varied by source. Yet across French, British, Russian, German, and American maps produced between 1750 and 1815, the same entity appears with remarkable consistency. British cartographer John Carey published his Quote 5 in 1806. Carey's work set the standard for commercial cartography in the English-speaking world. His maps of Europe, Africa, and the Americas are still referenced by historians for their accuracy. In this same atlas, with the same cartographic rigor, Carey shows Tartary occupying Central Asia with clearly marked subdivisions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary. Not a single vague territory, but a geographic region with recognized political distinctions. The map includes cities, mountain ranges, and river systems with the precision Carey applied everywhere else. Russian imperial maps from the same period tell an even stranger story. The Russian Empire had direct territorial interests in the region. They were actively expanding eastward, claiming Siberian territories, establishing administrative control. Yet Russian cartographic surveys from 1780 through 1810 consistently marked boundaries between Russian possessions and Tartarian territories. These weren't aspirational borders showing future conquests. They were recognized limits of Russian authority, with Tartaria depicted as the neighboring political entity. Why would the Russian Empire acknowledge borders with a country that didn't exist? German academic cartography adds another layer. The Steeler Hand Atlas, published in Gotha and considered the most scientifically rigorous atlas of the era, shows Tartaria with internal administrative divisions. The German cartographers weren't operating under political pressure to recognize or ignore specific territories. They were documenting geographic reality as understood by European scholarship. And that scholarship, across multiple editions from 1790 through 1815, treated Tartaria as an established fact requiring no special explanation. Even American commercial atlases, produced for a market with no direct stake in Central Asian politics, show the same pattern. Matthew Carey's American Atlas from 1795 includes detailed maps of Asia depicting Great Tartarie with territorial extent matching European sources. American cartographers were copying European knowledge, true, but they were copying a consensus. Multiple independent sources, all showing the same political entity in the same location with the same general characteristics. The pattern repeated with disturbing exactness. French military maps, British commercial atlases, Russian imperial surveys, German academic publications, American reference works. Each tradition operated independently, served different purposes, worked from different source materials, yet all showed Tartaria as a recognized geographic and political reality from the mid-18th century through 1815. Then, within a decade, every tradition simultaneously revised its maps. Not gradually, not through competing interpretations, but in synchronized erasure. By 1825, maps from all these sources show the same territory with the unified designation removed. The land remains. The cities, rivers, and mountains all appear in their proper locations. But the political entity vanishes from cartographic consensus as if it had never been there at all. This presents a coordination problem that conventional explanations can't address. Around 1816, something changed. Maps published after this date lack the characteristics of their predecessors. The same cartographers, working for the same institutions, using the same source networks, suddenly began depicting Central Asia differently. Not with improved detail or refined accuracy, but with systematic relabeling that erased Tartaria as a political designation. John Carey's atlas went through multiple editions. The 1806 version shows Tartary with clear subdivisions and administrative structure. The 1824 edition, produced by the same publishing house using Carey's established methods, shows the identical geographic region labeled as underscore, quote underscore, 13 underscore, and underscore, quote underscore, 14 underscore. The cities remain in the same locations. The mountain ranges haven't moved. The river systems follow the same courses, but the unified political entity has been replaced by imperial attributions to neighboring powers. British cartographic records offer no explanation for the change, no errata sheets, no published corrections, no scholarly articles explaining new geographic discoveries that required revision. The maps simply changed, edition to edition, as if the previous designation had been an error requiring silent correction. The French pattern mirrors the British exactly. Military maps from 1817 and 1818 show the same territories that appeared as Grande Tartarie in 1814, now divided between Russian, Chinese, and what they vaguely term independent territories. The division wasn't gradual, it was abrupt replacement. One year showing unified Tartaria, the next year showing fragmented attributions to external powers. Russian imperial cartography underwent the same transformation. Maps produced for the Ministry of War in 1815 mark clear boundaries between Russian administrative regions and Tartarian territory. By 1820, those same boundaries have shifted eastward. and Russian imperial possession now extends across areas previously shown as Tartarian. No military campaigns are documented for this expansion. No treaties recorded the territorial transfer. The maps changed, but the historical record offers no events to justify the cartographic revision. What happened? The official narrative offers changing political realities, shifting imperial borders, updated geographic knowledge, but those explanations don't account for the simultaneity. Cartographic traditions that operated independently, that served different national interests, that worked from different source materials, all revised their maps of Central Asia within the same narrow window. French military geographers, British commercial cartographers, Russian imperial surveyors, German academic publishers all reached the same conclusion at the same time. Tartaria needed to disappear from their maps. Nations don't simultaneously agree to relabel vast territories unless coordinated by something beyond routine cartographic updates. And that coordination left no trace in the public record, no conference proceedings, no published standards for the new nomenclature. The revision happened in silence, acknowledged by no one, explained by nothing. The historical record from this period offers its own anomalies. If a continental empire ceased to exist in 1816, we'd expect documentation. Treaties acknowledging territorial transfers, diplomatic correspondence regarding the political transition, official pronouncements from neighboring powers. These records don't exist. I started with the Russian Imperial Archives, the most logical source for documentation of Central Asian political changes. Russia had the most direct territorial interest in the region. Any major political reorganization would require Russian diplomatic engagement, treaty negotiations, military planning. The archive indexes list thousands of documents from the 1810s concerning Siberian administration, border security, trade regulation. But files specifically addressing Tartaria or its dissolution are conspicuously absent. The catalog shows gaps. Document series that should be continuous break-off in 1815, resume in 1818. 3 years of correspondence simply missing from collections that otherwise maintain meticulous chronological order. When I requested access to border administration files from 1816 and 1817, the archivist checked the catalog, then checked the physical storage. The files were listed but couldn't be located, lost, damaged, or never properly archived. She couldn't say which. British Foreign Office records show the same pattern. The Great Game, Britain's strategic competition with Russia over Central Asia, generated extensive diplomatic correspondence. Files from 1810 through 1814 discuss trade routes, intelligence gathering, and diplomatic positioning regarding Central Asian territories. Files from 1819 onward focus on Russian expansion and British countermeasures. The period between 1815 and 1818 produces almost nothing. A few routine dispatches, nothing substantive, and nothing that acknowledges any change in the political organization of the region. The gaps appear precisely where documentation should be most robust. Not random archival losses scattered across decades, but concentrated absences in the exact years when maps were being systematically redrawn. Chinese imperial records from the Qing dynasty present the same problem. Border administration documents that should detail any changes in territorial claims or neighboring political entities show redacted sections for the 1815 to 1817 period. The redactions aren't recent. They appear to be original, sections deliberately left blank or removed before binding. What required such careful omission from official records? No treaties in European diplomatic archives acknowledge Tartaria's formal dissolution. No documents record the annexation of its territories by Russia, China, or any other power. No correspondence between European capitals discusses the political transition. The entity that appeared on maps for 70 years simply vanishes from diplomatic recognition without leaving a paper trail. The absence of documentation is itself documentation. It reveals what someone didn't want preserved. One document that survived offers troubling implications. A diplomatic letter preserved without explanation shows correspondence between a British trade envoy and the Foreign Office. Dated November 1815, it discusses trade negotiations with _quote _17_ and references _quote _18_ with the bureaucratic normalcy reserved for established states. The envoy, stationed in a trading post near what's now the Kazakhstan-Russia border, writes about tariff rates, shipping schedules, and commercial regulations as if dealing with routine diplomatic matters. The language is what matters here. He doesn't describe Tartaria as a vague geographic region or a collection of independent tribes. He references specific governmental structures. Customs authorities imply organized revenue collection. Representatives of the Grand Khan suggest a centralized monarchy with diplomatic protocols. The letter mentions _quote_19_ indicating awareness of internal Tartarian political affairs at the highest level. This wasn't exploratory contact or initial diplomatic outreach. The tone suggests established relations, the kind of routine correspondence that only develops after years of regular interaction. The envoy assumes his superiors at the Foreign Office understand the context, requires no explanation of who the Grand Khan is or what authority Tartarian customs officials possess. He's reporting on negotiations within an existing framework, not discovering a new political entity. The letter includes a detailed description of a meeting with what he calls _quote_20_ discussing proposed changes to import duties on British textiles. He notes the minister's concerns about maintaining territorial revenue standards and the need to consult with provincial administrators before finalizing any agreement. This is the language of functioning bureaucracy, suggesting administrative divisions, revenue systems, and hierarchical decision-making processes. Then the correspondence simply stops. No follow-up letters appear in the file. No resolution to the succession question. No final agreement on the tariff negotiations. The envoy's reports, which had been regular monthly dispatches for the previous 2 years, cease entirely in December 1815. The file contains no explanation, no transfer notice, no indication of why the diplomatic thread ends mid-discussion. The succession question was never resolved in archived correspondence. The Grand Khan, whoever held that title in 1815, vanishes from the diplomatic record along with the customs authorities, the commercial minister, and the entire governmental structure the British envoy described as operational fact. This pattern of vanishing extends beyond documents. Some of these structures standing today in Kazakhstan, Western China, and Southern Siberia show architectural characteristics that historians attribute to local traditions. But the characteristics aren't local. They're consistent across 3,000 miles. Star fortresses appear throughout the region, geometric defensive structures with angular bastions designed for artillery defense. The design is specific, a pentagonal or hexagonal layout that became standard in European military architecture during the 17th century. These aren't simple walls or earthwork defenses. They're sophisticated fortifications requiring geometric precision and engineering knowledge, and they appear from the Caspian Sea to Lake Baikal with remarkable uniformity, as if built from common specifications. Near Tobolsk, a fortress complex shows construction techniques that local historical societies attribute to Russian expansion in the 1700s. The dating fits the accepted narrative of Russian imperial growth. But architectural analysis reveals anomalies. The stonework uses binding techniques that don't match documented Russian military construction from that period. The layout follows patterns more consistent with earlier European fortress design, and the sheer scale suggests resources beyond what Russian frontier garrisons typically commanded. The fortress could hold a standing force of several thousand, with supply storage for extended siege conditions. That's not a frontier outpost, that's an imperial administrative center. Further east, near what's now Almaty, building foundations show the remnants of administrative complexes. Modern development has obscured most of the original structures, but archaeological surveys from the 1960s documented the extent before construction covered the sites. The foundations formed a regular grid pattern spanning several city blocks, with a central structure larger than surrounding buildings. The layout matches administrative palace designs, a central authority building surrounded by ministerial offices and record-keeping facilities. Carbon dating of timber elements from the foundations placed construction in the late 1700s or early 1800s. Road stations appear at regular intervals along what are now minor routes through the steppes. These aren't crude traveler shelters. They're purpose-built facilities with standardized design, stone construction, spaces for horses and supply storage, sleeping quarters that could accommodate official travelers. The spacing is deliberate, roughly 30 kilometers apart, the distance a mounted courier could cover in half a day. This is infrastructure for a postal or courier system, the kind of network that requires centralized planning and ongoing maintenance. In Western China, structures that Chinese historical records attribute to local governance show the same design elements as buildings 2,000 kilometers west. The same stone-cutting techniques, the same architectural proportions, the same spatial organization. These weren't independent developments. They represent infrastructure planning requiring centralized authority, coordinated resources, and unified architectural vision. The kind of infrastructure an empire builds. The conventional explanation requires us to believe in remarkable coincidences, that multiple nations independently stopped labeling Tartaria on their maps within the same 5-year window, that French military cartographers, British commercial publishers, Russian imperial surveyors, and German academic geographers all reached identical conclusions about Central Asian political geography without documented communication. That a vast territory reorganized politically without generating diplomatic correspondence, without treaty negotiations, without official announcements from any neighboring power. That architectural unity spanning 3,000 miles emerged from independent local traditions rather than centralized planning. That trade routes requiring Tartarian customs authorities suddenly needed no acknowledgement of territorial sovereignty. That a British envoy could negotiate with representatives of the Grand Khan in November 1815, then never mention that government again without explanation. That the succession question referenced in diplomatic correspondence simply ceased to matter to anyone. That star fortresses built to identical specifications across half a continent represent coincidental architectural evolution. That administrative complexes with standardized layouts appeared in locations separated by months of travel without coordination. That road stations spaced at precise intervals for courier networks developed spontaneously rather than through imperial planning. That all major European archives developed gaps in their Central Asian documentation for the exact same years. That Russian border administration files for 1816 to 1817 went missing from otherwise complete series. That British Foreign Office correspondence breaks off mid-negotiation and resumes 3 years later without acknowledging the interruption. The Chinese imperial records show deliberate redactions in border documentation from precisely this period. That encyclopedia entries describing Tartaria in detail were removed from later editions, not because information changed, but because earlier scholars had been systematically mistaken. That linguistic references to Tartarian language were reclassified as European confusion rather than documentation of reality. That cartographic consensus spanning 70 years was somehow wrong, corrected simultaneously across competing national traditions without explanation. That none of this required coordination, that these are all independent coincidental developments, that the official narrative of gradual political evolution and improved geographic knowledge explains everything adequately. How many coincidences before we're obligated to consider alternative explanations? The deeper I went into cartographic archives, the clearer the pattern became. Let me be precise about what we're examining here. Between approximately 1816 and 1825, the cartographic representation of Central Asia underwent systematic revision across European, American, and Asian sources. This wasn't gradual evolution reflecting new discoveries or improved surveying techniques. It was coordinated relabeling of a territory that had been consistently depicted as a unified political entity for the previous 70 years. 3 powers had the most to gain from this revision. Russian imperial expansion into Central Asia accelerates dramatically after 1816. The territories that maps had shown as Tartaria become, quote, 23 in successive cartographic editions. By 1850, Russian administrative control extends across regions that earlier maps had marked as foreign territory. The expansion required justification, both domestically and in international diplomacy. An empire can't be seen as conquering established states without diplomatic consequences. But filling vacant territory, civilizing lawless regions, bringing order to fragmented peoples, that's acceptable imperial enterprise. Erasing Tartaria from maps created the narrative space for Russian expansion. British strategic interests aligned perfectly with this revision. The Great Game, Britain's competition with Russia for influence in Central Asia required depicting the region as available for imperial contest. If Tartaria existed as a functioning political entity, British operations in the region would constitute interference in a sovereign state. But if the territory was merely scattered khanates and tribal territories, British intelligence gathering, diplomatic maneuvering, and military positioning became legitimate great power strategy. British maps after 1820 consistently show Central Asia as politically fragmented, a power vacuum waiting to be filled rather than an organized state requiring diplomatic recognition. The Chinese Qing dynasty benefited similarly. Western territorial claims expanded significantly in the decades following 1816. Areas that earlier maps showed as Tartarian territory appear in Chinese cartography as historical possessions being rightfully reclaimed. The narrative of restoring imperial boundaries worked only if those boundaries had never been occupied by a rival state. Tartaria's existence would have complicated Chinese territorial claims. Its absence from maps simplified them considerably. All three powers expanding into the same region, all three requiring the same revision to justify their expansion. All three seeing their cartographic traditions change in the same narrow time frame. The geopolitical motive for coordinated erasure was overwhelming. A unified Tartaria had to vanish from maps before it could be divided on the ground, creating the narrative of uncivilized. Fragmented territory justified what would otherwise be naked imperial conquest. This strategic necessity manifested in specific textual revisions. I obtained multiple editions of major encyclopedias published between 1800 and 1840. The revisions tell their own story. The Encyclopedia Britannica's third edition, published in 1797, contains a substantial entry on Tartary. Multiple pages describing the geography, climate, principal cities, and governmental structure. The entry treats Tartary as established fact, requiring no justification for its inclusion. The text describes the dominions of the Great Cham, with the same matter-of-fact tone used for entries on France or Spain. It references trade routes, administrative divisions, and diplomatic relations with neighboring powers. By the 1823 edition, the entry has been dramatically reduced. What was several pages becomes a single paragraph noting that Tartary is a geographic designation for Central Asian steppes, not a political entity. The earlier edition's detailed descriptions are gone. No mention of governmental structure, no reference to the Great Cham, no acknowledgement of administrative divisions. The revision doesn't explain what happened to the political entity described in 1797. It simply treats the earlier information as if it never existed. French encyclopedias show identical patterns. The Encyclopédie Méthodique, published in installments through the early 1800s, includes detailed Tartarie entries in its geographic volumes from 1782 through 1815. Later supplements systematically reduce this content, not updating it with new information, removing established entries and replacing them with vague references to various nomadic peoples occupying the region. The pattern isn't correction, it's erasure. The encyclopedias don't present evidence that earlier scholars misunderstood Tartary's political organization. They don't cite new discoveries that invalidated previous knowledge. They simply delete the information and replace it with alternatives that deny Tartary ever functioned as the unified entity earlier editions had described. Later editions treat earlier references as errors without explaining what made them errors. On whose authority did detailed governmental descriptions become geographic vagueness? What evidence justified removing information that had been considered factual enough for inclusion in the most authoritative reference works of the age? What were they correcting? And on whose authority did knowledge become error? Around the same period, linguistic references underwent similar revision. Linguistic studies from the early 1800s reference quote 28 as a distinct language or language family. Later scholarship treats these references as confused errors, attributing them to European misunderstanding of Turkic languages. Johann Christoph Adelung's Mithridates, published between 1806 and 1817, was the most comprehensive comparative linguistics work of its era. Adelung cataloged hundreds of languages, providing sample texts and grammatical descriptions. He includes entries for Tartarian as a distinct linguistic category separate from Turkish, Mongolian, or Chinese. He references grammatical structures, provides vocabulary examples, and notes regional variations within what he considers a unified language family. Adelung wasn't a casual observer. He was one of Europe's leading philologists, working from source materials gathered by traders, missionaries, and diplomatic contacts. His linguistic classifications were based on direct textual evidence, not speculation. Yet by the 1830s, linguistic scholarship dismisses his Tartarian references as misidentification. Modern linguistics has no category for what Adelung documented. Other European linguists from the same period made similar references. Peter Simon Pallas, working for the Russian Academy of Sciences, compiled linguistic surveys of Russian territories and neighboring regions in the 1780s and 1790s. His work references Tartarian dialects as distinct from the Turkic languages he documented elsewhere. He notes grammatical features that don't align with other language families in the region, suggesting either a distinct linguistic tradition or significant divergence from related languages. French Orientalist scholars publishing in the early 1800s referenced Tartarian in their comparative studies of Asian languages. They treat it as an established category requiring no special justification, the same way they reference Persian, Arabic, or Sanskrit. The assumption in these works is that Tartarian exists as a linguistic reality, documented sufficiently that readers would understand the reference without extensive explanation. Then scholarly consensus shifts. By the mid-1820s, references to Tartarian language begin appearing with skeptical framing. Scholars suggest earlier researchers were confused, that they mistook various Turkic dialects for a unified language. That quote 32 was never a specific linguistic category, but rather a European catch-all term for languages they didn't properly understand. The reassignment was systematic. What earlier scholars had documented as Tartarian becomes reclassified as various Turkic dialects, Mongolian influences, Yahud, or unidentified regional variations. The evidence wasn't refuted through linguistic analysis. It was reclassified until it no longer pointed to what it originally documented. Grammars claiming to describe Tartarian disappear from library catalogs or get reclassified under other language families. Vocabulary lists attributed to Tartarian sources are reinterpreted as corrupted versions of known languages. The linguistic category vanishes not because new evidence disproved its existence, but because scholarly consensus decided it shouldn't exist. The final piece appeared in a document that was never meant to be public. A diplomatic file declassified in the 1990s contains correspondence between Russian and Austrian diplomats dated March 18, 17. The subject line reads, "Resolution of the Tartarian Question." The correspondence discusses coordinating policy regarding what it calls territorial adjustments in Central Asia. The language is careful diplomatic phrasing that acknowledges sensitivity without stating explicit details. One letter references necessary cartographic adjustments to reflect current political realities and mentions the importance of maintaining revised boundaries to prevent destabilization. The phrasing is critical, not creating new boundaries, maintaining revised ones. The implication is that boundaries had already been changed, and diplomatic coordination was required to ensure the changes held. The correspondence treats this as a settled matter requiring administrative follow-through rather than an ongoing negotiation. Another letter in the file mentions coordinating with relevant parties to ensure uniform representation in official documentation. Relevant parties aren't specified. Uniform representation suggests multiple governments or institutions needed to align their position. On what? The correspondence never states explicitly. But the subject line provides context. The Tartarian question required resolution. Official documentation needed uniform representation. Cartographic adjustments were necessary. A memo dated April 1817 references _quote_41_ and notes that _quote_42_ underscore. Which arrangements? The file doesn't specify. British interests in what region? Not stated. But the timing aligns perfectly with the period when British maps stopped showing Tartaria. The most revealing passage appears in a letter discussing implementation. It mentions ensuring scholarly authorities receive appropriate guidance regarding historical interpretation of the territories in question. Scholarly authorities receiving guidance. historical interpretation being shaped through official channels. This isn't diplomats discussing current events. This is coordinated effort to control how the past is understood. The file contains only partial correspondence. Several letters referenced in the existing documents are missing, references to enclosures that should be attached but aren't. The file index lists documents by date, but gaps appear in the sequence. Letters numbered 7, 9, and 14 through 17 aren't present, though the numbering continues around them. The correspondence proves coordination. It references an event or situation requiring diplomatic response across multiple governments. It discusses cartographic revision as policy, not as improved geographic knowledge. It mentions guiding scholarly interpretation, suggesting deliberate shaping of historical narrative. But what that event was, what happened to require this level of coordination? What made Tartaria a quote 45 needing quote 46, the surviving pages never specify. I reached out to diplomatic historians, archival specialists, cartographic scholars. I asked simple questions. Why did cartographic consensus change in 1816? Where are the diplomatic records of Tartaria's dissolution? How do we explain architectural unity across 3,000 miles? The silence was overwhelming. Diplomatic historians acknowledged the gaps in archival records but offered no explanation beyond routine document loss. When I pointed out that the losses cluster precisely in the years when maps were being revised, they suggested that perhaps those years generated less correspondence. When I noted that these were years of major imperial expansion, requiring extensive diplomatic coordination, they had no response. Cartographic scholars attributed the changes to improved geographic knowledge. Explorers provided better information, surveying techniques advanced, political realities on the ground became clearer to European mapmakers. But when I asked what specific expeditions or surveys prompted the revisions, which explorers provided the new information, they couldn't cite sources. The explanation relied on vague progress rather than documented discovery. Archivists were more direct. They acknowledged the pattern of missing documents, but insisted it proved nothing. Archives have gaps. Files get mislabeled, damaged, lost to fire or water, or simple bureaucratic neglect. That the gaps appear in multiple national archives during the same years was unfortunate coincidence, not evidence of coordination. When I asked whether they'd investigated why these particular documents went missing, they said investigation would require resources they didn't have. Academic historians dismissed the questions as conspiracy thinking. The evidence I presented, the maps, the architectural remains, the diplomatic correspondence, the encyclopedia revisions all had conventional explanations. Tartaria was a geographic designation, not a political entity. The Grand Khan mentioned in British correspondence was a local ruler, not an emperor. The linguistic references were misidentifications. The coordinated cartographic changes reflected scholarly consensus catching up to reality. Not hostility, not defensiveness, just disinterest. As if the questions themselves were irrelevant. The maps exist. Therefore, they've been explained. The timeline is documented, therefore it's accurate. The official record is complete, therefore no investigation is needed. But the official record isn't complete. It's riddled with gaps, revisions, and coordinated omissions. I asked simple questions. Why did cartographic consensus change in 1816? Where are the diplomatic records of Tartaria's dissolution? How do we explain architectural unity across 3,000 miles? The silence was overwhelming. Diplomatic historians dismissed the questions as fringe conspiracy theory. The declassified correspondence I referenced, taken out of context, they said. Tartarian Question was diplomatic shorthand for border disputes with various Central Asian Khanates, not evidence of coordinated erasure. The fact that no such border disputes appear in the historical record for that period didn't warrant further explanation. Archivists acknowledged the gaps in documentation but provided no explanation. Yes, Russian border administration files for 1816 to 1817 are missing. Yes, British Foreign Office correspondence shows unusual breaks. Yes, Chinese imperial records have redacted sections. These things happen. Archives are incomplete. Documents get lost, damaged, misfiled. The pattern of synchronized gaps across multiple national archives in the exact same years? Coincidence, presumably. Cartographic scholars attributed the changes to improved geographic knowledge. European understanding of Central Asian geography advanced significantly in the early 19th century, they explained. Earlier maps showing unified Tartaria were based on limited information. As exploration increased and surveying improved, cartographers corrected their earlier errors. The fact that corrections appeared simultaneously across competing national traditions, that they all revised in the same direction, that no new explorations or surveys from 1816 to 1820 are documented in the historical record. None of this seemed to require investigation. Each type of expert acknowledged the evidence I presented, then immediately framed it within conventional explanations that left the fundamental questions unanswered. Yes, maps changed. Yes, documents are missing. Yes, encyclopedias were revised. But these are normal historical processes, not anomalies requiring alternative explanations. Not hostility, not defensiveness, just disinterest, as if the questions themselves were irrelevant. The maps exist, therefore they've been explained. The timeline is documented, therefore it's accurate. The official record is complete, therefore no investigation is needed. But the timeline isn't accurate. It's riddled with gaps, revisions, and coordinated omissions. Let me be precise about what the evidence shows. Tartaria existed on maps as a recognized political entity from the mid-1700s through 1815. French military cartographers, British commercial publishers, Russian imperial surveyors, German academic geographers, and American atlas makers all depicted it with consistent territorial extent, internal administrative divisions, and governmental structure. This wasn't speculative geography or cartographic convention. These were operational maps, reference works, and official surveys treating Tartaria as established fact. Multiple independent sources showed the same thing. Encyclopedia entries described its governance, linguistic studies referenced Tartarian language. Diplomatic correspondence discussed negotiations with representatives of the Grand Khan. British trade envoys reported on customs authorities and commercial regulations. The documentation treated Tartaria the same way it treated any recognized state, with bureaucratic normalcy suggesting routine relations rather than extraordinary claims. After 1816, systematic cartographic revision erased the designation. Not gradually through improved knowledge, but abruptly within a 5-year window. Maps from 1820 show identical geography with completely different political labels. The unified entity becomes fragmented attributions to neighboring empires. No new surveys justify the change. No explorations document discoveries requiring revision. The maps simply change, simultaneously across competing national traditions. Diplomatic records from this period are missing or redacted. Russian border administration files for 1816 to 1817 absent from otherwise complete series. British Foreign Office correspondence breaking off mid-negotiation in 1815, resuming in 1819, without acknowledging the interruption. Chinese imperial records showing deliberate redactions in border documentation from precisely these years. The gaps aren't random archival losses. They're concentrated absences in the exact period when cartographic consensus shifted. Physical infrastructure suggests unified imperial administration. Star fortresses built to identical specifications across 3,000 miles. Administrative complexes with standardized layouts in locations separated by months of travel. Road stations spaced at precise intervals for courier networks. This is coordinated imperial infrastructure, not independent local development. Declassified documents prove coordination on the Tartarian Question. Diplomatic correspondence from March 1817 discusses necessary cartographic adjustments, maintaining revised boundaries, and ensuring uniform representation in official documentation. The language acknowledges that boundaries had already been revised and coordination was required to maintain the changes. Academic institutions refuse serious investigation. Historians dismiss questions as conspiracy theory. Archivists acknowledge gaps but offer no explanation. Cartographic scholars attribute changes to improved knowledge without citing the improvements. The pattern is consistent. Acknowledge evidence, dismiss implications, provide conventional explanations that don't address the actual anomalies. Someone made very sure we'd never know what Tartaria was, who ruled it, or what happened in 1816 to require its erasure from cartography, diplomacy, and memory. The maps remain. The maps remain. The buildings stand, those that haven't been demolished or reclassified beyond recognition. The diplomatic file with its missing pages sits in archives, accessible to researchers willing to look. The evidence persists despite generations of careful neglect. Pierre Lapie's 1814 military map showing Grande Tartarie still exists in the Bibliothèque Nationale. John Carey's 1806 atlas depicting Tartary with administrative subdivisions is available in university collections. The Encyclopedia Britannica's 1797 edition describing the dominions of the Great Cham hasn't been destroyed, just superseded by later editions that erase the information without explanation. The star fortresses still stand across Kazakhstan and Siberia, their geometric precision visible to anyone examining the structures. But the questions remain unanswered. What was Tartaria? Not the vague geographic designation it became after 1820, but the political entity that appeared on official maps for 70 years, that British envoys negotiated with, that required diplomatic coordination to erase from cartography and memory. Who was the Grand Khan referenced in 1815 correspondence? What happened to the succession question that was being discussed in November of that year? Why did three empires coordinate to remove a unified political designation from maps within the same 5-year window? What required, quote, 52, quote, unquote, 53, quote? What made Tartaria a question needing resolution? Where did the diplomatic records go? Why do Russian, British, and Chinese archives all show gaps in the exact same years? What was in the missing pages of the declassified file, the letters numbered 7, 9, and 14 through 17, that the index lists but the archive doesn't contain? The official narrative doesn't explain the evidence. It ignores the simultaneous cartographic revision across competing national traditions. It dismisses the architectural unity spanning 3,000 miles as coincidence. It attributes archival gaps to normal document loss, despite their concentrated appearance in the precise years requiring explanation. It treats encyclopedia revisions as routine corrections without citing what new knowledge justified removing established entries. Something was here before the accepted chronology acknowledges. Something significant enough that 3 expanding empires needed to coordinate its removal from maps. Something that required guiding scholarly authorities on historical interpretation. Something that left physical infrastructure, diplomatic correspondence, and 70 years of consistent cartographic documentation before vanishing in coordinated silence. I wasn't looking for proof of Tartaria. I was looking for an explanation that fits the evidence, and the further I dug, the clearer it became. Whatever Tartaria was, it was significant enough that 3 empires coordinated its removal from history. The last king vanished in 1816. The maps were redrawn, and we're told it never existed at all. What else vanished before we knew to look for it? And what else are we still being told never was?